Hello, and that's Other George. I remembered it, so you don't have to. And about a year ago I made a video on why it's cool to hate the Spider-Man trilogy, detailing both why I disagree with a lot of the criticisms thrown against the trilogy, and why I believe Spider-Man 1 and 2 are the best superhero movies of all time. But today's video will primarily focus on the criticisms from Doug Walker, or the Nostalgia Critic. Many creators have spoken against his reviews before, talking about how they're either super cringe or just poorly put together. Even Ralph the film creator made fun of it. And speaking of, when I did my response to Ralph's video a couple months back, there's quite a few people commenting saying that I'm not in a position to criticize his review because it was very hyperbolic and included a lot of joke criticism. And this to me is just a poor excuse that's also used to defend bad comedy films and shows, because there are excellent examples of comedy films, there are excellent examples of comedy shows, which all clearly demonstrate that you can still balance both quality and being comedic, in the same way that there are excellent examples of comedic reviews on YouTube. You can still be comedic whilst offering a good set of critiques. Sadly, it's not quite the case with this video. So let's swing right into this video and take a look at some of the critiques from the critic himself.
Damn you. Damn you.
Watching through Doug's video, I don't necessarily believe that he despises these films, but I think he's certainly riding off this idea that they're not as good as you remember. So before we get into responding, I will say that I won't be breaking down the video in its entirety, simply because of the amount of terrible skits and just random comments where I can't really respond to anything. I will just be focusing on the more substantive arguments. So at the start of the video, Nostalgia Critic briefly says that there's been a handful of quality Spider-Man movies since the Raimi trilogy. I think his point is that we can now look back at the Raimi trilogy and analyse if it lives up to the newer films. And I'm not personally huge on the Amazing Spider-Man films, but I think the MCU Spider-Man movies are pretty great, and I think Into the Spider-Verse is excellent. But with that being said, and maybe it's because I'm slightly biased, but I do prefer the Raimi trilogy over them. However, at the same time they are quite different, so it's quite difficult to compare in that aspect. After that, Doug introduces the first Spider-Man film, released in 2002. He explains how it got the ball rolling for comic book movies, and then asks the question.
So this film is owed a lot of things. But, as we asked before, does it still hold up 18 years after it came out? And can the people who grew up with it still find appreciation in its bizarreness?
My short answer would be that if you can forgive the dated CGI, then this film absolutely holds up in every other regard. But critics' first criticism is the lack of subtlety in Peter obtaining his powers at the start of the movie.
While taking her picture, Peter gets bitten by an escaped spider.
Subtle.
Now with Doug's style, I believe this is just meant to be a quick ding, just to acknowledge that he has a little nitpick with the film, and then I guess we're meant to move on. But to me, I've got absolutely no idea what's wrong with this. I guess the idea of something being subtle is quite subjective from person to person. However, here I think it's a good thing to have. It's a presentation for all the students to understand what it is they're studying, so it makes sense for it to be there, and it's beneficial to us, the audience, to get an understanding of what Peter will be capable of in this film, and so that we fully understand what the stakes and limitations are as well. Maybe it could have been presented in a more subtle way, but presenting it is better than not presenting it if you ask me. Doug later states not a criticism, but rather an interesting fact that's worth playing.
Now apparently this wasn't CGI and it took 156 takes to finally get this right.
Which cool, I never knew that. Mr. Critic then comments on Tobey Maguire being looked at only as a meme by the internet.
Hey, it's how the internet reacted when they heard Maguire was cast in the role. Don't worry, a treasure trove of memes shall be thine reward.
I'm not sure about anyone else here, but I think Doug was secretly referencing his own career. But he surprisingly compliments the rest of the scene.
After honestly a really great action sequence, probably my favorite in the movie, which is a weird problem, but we'll get to that. Peter doesn't get all his money because he defeated him too early.
And then goes on to give another critique.
The manager gets mugged though, running past Peter, who gets out of his way.
Thanks. What the hell's the matter with you? You let him go.
Well, as a security guard, we always advise kids to stop armed men, idiot.
I can sort of see where he's coming from with this one, but Peter does very clearly gracefully step aside, actually feeling glad that the person he just argued with got robbed, and the fact that the guy even says thanks is pretty much confirmation for that. But even though it's such a minor thing anyway, it's fine to say that the security guard having a go at him is a little bit weird. But whatever, he later in the video expresses his feelings towards the initial fight between Spider-Man and the Green Goblin.
So as you can see, this entire action sequence is completely nuts. But because of that, it's kind of amazing. I give it 3.5 little WTFs. Yay!
Which, whilst I despise his delivery, I completely agree with the sentiment. I love these and all the other films Raimi has directed, such as the Evil Dead trilogy and Drag Me to Hell. They're so ludicrous and over the top that they become intentionally funny. But don't worry, we later stumble into a really bad take when discussing the Green Goblin going to the Daily Bugle.
Who's the photographer who takes the pictures of Spider-Man? I don't know who he is. His stuff comes in the mail. You're lying! I swear.
So Jameson's willing to put his life on the line for Parker? That's like Bluto sticking his neck out for Popeye. It's possible, but you gotta explain it.
This take is so bad that even Movie Bob of all people responded to it. And Bob is completely right because a character showing a previously unseen side is Dimension. But on top of that, like a few times during this trilogy we do see that Jameson often puts on an act in front of his employees and does actually have empathy that he just doesn't tend to show. Spider-Man 2 contains the best example of this. Peter is constantly being beat down by the media, which causes him to lose motivation, which eventually causes him to lose his powers. So he just chucks the suit in the trash. Jameson is pleased when he finds out, but later on feels very guilty for his actions, because at that portion of the story, Spider-Man was needed now more than ever. But then Peter's motivation is back and he reclaims the suit. So Jameson just resumes his act. Point being that every character in this trilogy are like onions. They have layers to them, and are a bit more complicated and fleshed out rather than being just one-dimensional with few motivations. Such a ridiculous point. After a few more complaints about the CGI and some unfunny jokes sprinkled in there, Critic gives a compliment to the climax of the film.
Spider-Man saves Mary Jane and the kids, but the Goblin grabs him and takes him to, honestly, the second best fight in the movie. Again, I think that's because there's not a lot of half-ass CGI and it feels more gritty and grounded. It's even one of the few times the Goblin's mask looks pretty cool.
That's a thumbs up from me. Well done, you got something right. Nostalgia Critic wraps up his review and jumps to more of a conclusion segment.
If you don't take it that seriously and just embrace the hilariously sugar-coated world, it is kind of fun. It's paced well, it's a decently laid out origin story, and its angles and imagery are very old school comic book.
I agree?
It's funny, a lot of younger people that grew up with this find themselves disliking it as they get older, but since I watched it with a more cynical mind and the cinematic environment around me has changed, I actually find myself enjoying it. If I focus on the passion and creativity rather than the details.
I disagree. It's a fun, cheesy movie, but it's also very well written and stands the test of time amongst other comic book movies. And the more bland superhero movies I watch, the more I just absolutely appreciate how good the Spider-Man trilogy truly was. Well, you know, the first two. And that's the end of his video. Thank God. It's actually the longest video I've responded to in this series, but because of how much vapid nonsense it contains, it basically just boils down to a 3-minute little review. What I'm trying to say is that if you think this video is lackluster, it's his fault, okay? It's not mine. Thank you very much for watching. This was a good excuse for me to dive straight back into the Raimi trilogy and make another Cool to Hate episode on it. So yeah, this was a lot of fun to do. And just before I let you go, I just want to let you all know that I do have an Instagram account where I do some video updates, fun story Q&As, and brag about my interactions with celebrities. So if you could go over there, drop me a follow and get me to 200, that would be very much appreciated. But yeah, with that being said, I've been your host, That Other George, and I shall see you all in the next video. Goodbye.